But if you had told me 20 years ago that one day I would not be able to speak in public unless surrounded by a phalanx of armed men, I would not have believed you.
So the other night, February 1st, in downtown Seattle, Washington, there was a talk called Fighting the New Misogyny, a feminist critique of gender identity. And for anyone who doesn't know, gender identity is sort of another way to say transgenderism. So they're critiquing the mainstream transgender movement. It featured the speakers Lear Keith, Megan Murphy, Saba Malik, and Kara Dansky. They gave a critical analysis of gender identity, making, quote, powerful arguments for sex-based women's rights. The reason that I'm talking about it is because several things happened. There was an assault that was caught on camera, and protests that were happening, and I think there were several arrests. And it was also reported by the organization that put on the event, Women's Liberation Front, that there was a bomb threat to the library. The talk starts off with Megan Murphy, who discusses freedom of speech, democratic principles, sex-based rights, and the history of women's spaces and consciousness raising. I'll put some clips in so everyone can see some of the arguments that are being made and called hate speech.
I want to be clear that this isn't about trans rights. There are no rights being fought for trans people within this activism. The activists outside are not fighting to create services and safe spaces for trans-identified people. They're certainly not fighting for the children told they're trans because they like or dislike the color pink, being put on puberty blockers, hormones, and on a path to surgery and sterility. Rather, this is a fight to end women's rights, to destroy the very foundation for women's rights, and, in fact, to destroy the women's movement itself. I'm not being hyperbolic. If we can't define women as adult human females and argue that women share a particular experience in this world and have experienced historical oppression due only to having been born female, there is no basis for women's rights. Despite endless claims online that we're funded by evil right-wing institutions and that we're all getting rich off of all of this, that we're somehow operating from a position of power and privilege rather than from the ground up, the truth is that this is the women's movement.
Just for some context, Megan Murphy runs the Feminist Current. She writes and speaks about gender identity and transgenderism and its effect on women's rights. She's been in the news, and she's testified on Bill C-16 in Canada.
The problem with this bill is that it proposes to amend something as important as the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code in order to include something that isn't even definable.
She also received coverage because she was banned from Twitter for misgendering a man who identifies as a woman. This man calls himself Jessica Yaniv and has made international news recently for ridiculous antics, which you can look up otherwise, but we're getting off topic. I really only bring it up because I do think context is important. These women have been speaking about this for a long time. This isn't the first event that's been crashed. They have a lot going on. So yeah, let's get back to the talk.
And this is really important because I felt that as a woman of color, I should be here to refute the idea that believing biology is important and that a woman is an adult human female is the same as being racist. But let me say really clearly, I firmly believe that all human beings deserve basic human rights. They deserve to live without fear of oppression or violence, to have access to housing, to have access to jobs and equality before the law and judicial systems. Whoever you are, however you dress, however you present yourself, however you identify, none of that is up for discussion at all. It's a false comparison to conflate 400 years of slavery, murder, rape, torture, Jim Crow, and the segregation of public spaces by whites against black people with attempts to open women's bathrooms, shelters, prisons, locker rooms, and other female-only spaces. Thanks for the love. And other female-only spaces to male-born people simply on the basis that they identify as women. I don't have an unexplained fear of people who identify as transgender. I don't. I have a disagreement with their definition of what gender is. Okay? That's a far cry from being phobic. I'm not here to encourage violence towards anyone. I'm not here to claim that I'm better, or that I'm superior, or that I'm more evolved than anyone else. I'm here to question the idea that womanhood is something which anyone can identify into.
I just want to point out that I think their main argument has been clear so far, which is that basically trans women, or those people we call trans women, are men. They're male. They're biological males. And it just doesn't make them female just because they would identify as a female. That's really the main argument here. And obviously this goes against mainstream transgenderism, which says that trans women are women and anyone who identifies as a woman can be a woman.
In 1776, of course, Congress famously declared that men are created equal, and in 1789, the U.S. got its Constitution, which gave individual states the authority to determine voting rights. Not a single state at that time granted women the right to vote. We don't have to limit this historical discussion to voting rights, as important as they are. We could also talk, for example, about how a 17th century law in Massachusetts provided that women could be executed for luring men into marriage by wearing high-heeled shoes. Women were granted the right to practice law in U.S. federal court in 1879, but most states still prohibited women from practicing law in their state courts. And of course, abortion was outlawed in most of the United States throughout most of U.S. history. This is just a tiny list of times throughout U.S. history when U.S. law has explicitly discriminated against women. And let's be perfectly clear. All of the men making all of those laws over all of that time knew exactly what the word woman means.
And just for reference, that last speaker, Saba Malik, is one of the founders of Deep Green Resistance. Kierdansky is a lawyer who has worked on immigration law, as well as worked with the Women's Liberation Front to protect female-only spaces in schools. She's also been on the news regarding gender identity, representing females, protecting female rights.
I just want to take brief issue with how you characterize the issue as being from the left, because I just want to say there are many Democrats and people who identify as being on the left who are very angry about the takeover of women's sports and how the Democratic Party is handling
That's a fair point, and
gender.
you are certainly on the left.
So I hope I gave a good overview of some of the main points of the talk and some of the things that the women were going to the talk to say, and why really it's making everybody so mad. It's going against mainstream transgender ideology, which is trans women are women. They disagree with that. They say these gender ideas threaten women sex-based protections to erase the definition of what a sex-based protection is. There's a lot of clips online that you can see of people disrupting the event, screaming. There's several people arrested. You can go and watch those in further detail online. I thought it was important to platform the women and what the women had to say.
Horrible, Megan! Horrible!
Nothing you say can touch her.